everyone, and welcome to a talk entitled Getting the Best Out of Your Code Reviews. So first of all, if you want to follow along with the slides, here are a couple of links where you can actually read them and tag along, or read them later if you want to. Just to get started, a quick couple of notes about me, about who I am and how I got here. So I'm a software developer. First of all, I like to write code and I like to read code. I used to work as a developer advocate at Google. So I was basically helping people build applications on top of the Google Ads API. And I'm a maintainer and a contributor for several open source projects. And I'm also very fond of open source software in general. I think it's one of the best ideas humankind ever came up with. I used to teach children about playing football or soccer, depending on the part of the world you're located in. I used to teach people about computer graphics and software design at university. And I sometimes like to go speak at conferences or meetups. And I lately do this at home because of reasons. So as you can see, one of the common threads here is that I like to tell people why I like things and why I care about things, and I like to explain things to people. So that's one of the main reasons why I'm here today. And if this was an in-person conference, and if we were all in the same room, something I would have liked to do now is to show me your hands, because I have anecdotal evidence that there are several different types of experiences people have with code reviews and the whole process of doing code reviews in general. So there are some people who actually do code reviews usually and often, and they like it. There are some people who usually come to like this talk because they don't know anything about code reviews and they want to know what it's all about. And there are some people who actually have been told that code reviews are a good thing, but they don't really know why and what's the real reason to do so. So yeah, there's a lot of variety in how people experience the whole code reviewing process and in how they feel towards this process. So this is basically a huge reminder that says your mileage may vary and your experience may vary in how you do code reviews and how you experience the whole process. So this is basically a quick session where we will see how to do this in what I think is the best possible way and how to get the most out of it. And the first thing I want to start with is the real reason why I think every software development team should be doing code reviews. And it turns out that there's actually several reasons to do so. So the first one is what we usually call Linus's Law. So Linus is, of course, Linus Torvalds, which you may have heard about. And besides writing the kernel for Linux, he formulated this law that basically says that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. This is the original formulation. And what it means is that if you put enough eyeballs in front of a piece of code, all bugs that may or may not be in this code base tend to emerge. And they basically come to surface and they become visible. So doing code reviews is a great tool to make bugs emerge and surface. And what you get as a bonus from this is that you can share knowledge across your whole team. So basically you learn about how your business works because if you read code that somebody else in your team wrote, you may become more familiar with your business processes, for instance, or with your whole software architecture, or with, generally speaking, how your application ecosystem works. But it's not just like that. It's also about sharing knowledge at like a tinier level, where you basically read some code that somebody else in your team wrote, and you learn different ways to do things. You learn new techniques, you get new skills. And generally speaking, you become a better developer overall because you get exposed to more code and to more knowledge. And by just being exposed to knowledge, you share that knowledge and internalize it yourself. Then a very good reason why I think code reviewing is a best practice, it's a very good practice, is that you get rubber ducking for free. So rubber ducking is that practice where you have a problem, you don't know how to solve it, and you explain your problem to a rubber duck. And by verbalizing your problem, so what generally happens is that while you explain your problem, you instantly come up with a solution just by the fact that you verbalized it. So by putting your problem in words, you get a different angle of looking at it, and then a solution may appear to you. So when you have to write code and you have to write a pull request description, you basically have to explain what your code does. And by doing so, you get a better understanding of what it does, because in order to write what it does, you have to know what it does and to understand it in a different way that you get by verbalizing it in the pull request description. So having to write what your code does is also good communication practice. It is often told that we as software developers may or may not be the best communicators around, but in having to communicate what our code does to the rest of our team, we get a great practice in being able to make things as clear as they can be. Because we may be sharing our code with somebody that has no context about what it does, and we have to make it clearer. And we also have a very precise and definite scope for discussion. So when there is a discussion about a piece of code in a pull request, it's not like we are discussing something else like any personal issues or whatever. The only topic we can discuss is exactly the code we're discussing, and it's a tool to make the discussion very precise. So there is no room for ambiguity in a pull request review. And generally speaking, if you put all of these together, what you get to practice by doing a code review process done well is that you practice empathy, because when you review somebody else's code, you have to put yourself in their shoes. And you have to know that somebody else is going to be putting themselves in your shoes when reviewing your code. So the whole practice of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes is basically what empathy is all about. And I think empathy is one of the best skills that somebody can have to interact with the rest of their team. So this is an anecdote that I found out after I gave this talk more than once, and it's basically a great example about why doing code reviews can save you from bugs. So if you're familiar with the NPM ecosystem and with the JavaScript ecosystem in general, there is this tool called NPM that you can use to manage your software dependencies, and you can use it to save dependencies. So basically, when you want to install a new dependency and to keep track of it in your dependency descriptor file, your package.json file, you do, on your command line, you do npm install --, save dev, and the name of the dependency. But what happens if, and it often happens, what happens if you forget the double minus before save dev? What you're saying to npm is that you basically want to install a new dependency called save dev, and it will end up in your dependency management file. So luckily, the save dev name has been locked by the npm maintainers, and there is no actual package called save dev at the moment. But think about what will happen if it was a malicious dependency that you would include in your application by mistake. And it will end up in your dependency descriptor file, and it's the typical type of issue that really pops up in a code review. So this is the quintessential example of a bug that may very easily be introduced and may, the same way, very easily spotted by a good code reviewing process. So thing is, I just talked about a good code review process, but not all code review processes are good. There are a couple of mistakes that may happen when we do code reviews, or at least let's call them happy accidents. So The first and biggest mistake that you can make when you do a code review is this. So you write a pull request, and there's a lot of changes, like a huge lot, across a whole lot of different files. There's no helpful commit message, and there's no helpful description. So basically, this is not saying, hey, can you please review my changes? I just need a couple of extra eyeballs, and I want to make sure this works as expected. This is just saying, I don't care about your time, and I basically hate you. So another common mistake that happens when doing a code reviewing process is having too many reviewers. So you basically write some code, commit it, push it to the remote repository, create a pull request, and then set your whole team as a reviewer. So what will happen is that the first one to get the email to notify them that they need to review your code will open the pull request, see that there's like 15 people needing to review the code, and say, okay, yeah, somebody else will do this, and just skip. And in the end, nobody will read your code. So the question may be here, what is the right number of reviewers for a pull request? And it turns out there's several different possible rules that you can use to determine the right number of reviewers. So famously, Google has 2 reviewers for every pull request, or for every change list, as they call them internally, and they have to be different in nature. So one has to be aware of the context of the project you're working on, so they basically have knowledge or maybe even ownership about the code base you're working on. And the other doesn't necessarily need to know about the project, but they need to be knowledgeable in the language you're writing your code. So basically, what you get is that you get a review by somebody that has context, and a review that's by somebody that doesn't have context. And by having this 2 different types of reviews, you make sure your code is as explicit as it can be, as clear as it can be, and as appropriate to the context as it can be, so that you're not using, say, for instance, any libraries or idiomatic forms that are not being used in the project, or that it's not being clear enough to somebody that doesn't know exactly all the nooks and crannies about what it should do. Another possible approach is what GitLab uses. So they basically have chain reviewers. So you send your pull request, you choose one reviewer, and then it's up to them to decide if the code needs another review or it's ready to merge to production. So basically, they can pick another reviewer, which in turn is going to be able to pick another reviewer if they think it's necessary, until the last reviewer thinks that the code is ready to merge. This is another possible approach. In the end, it really depends on the team you work on. Say, for instance, I'm working in a very small team right now. It's 5 developers, so we usually have one reviewer for every pull request. And we try to rotate them just because we want to share knowledge as much as we can. And also to make sure that it's not like always the same guy to do reviews. The important thing is here that once you agree with the rest of your team with an approach, you stick to it so that everybody is clear and is certain upon what will happen to their pull request. So in the end, what you really want to avoid is this. This is something that should never happen to a pull request, and it's the quintessential way to do code reviews wrong. So if you have some code being merged without having been read or without having an actual review, you're basically defeating all the reasons why we said code reviews are a good thing. So you're not allowing bugs to surface. You're not sharing any type of knowledge, both at a macro level or at a micro level. You're not helping people verbalize their problems because they know nobody's going to listen and nobody's going to read what they write. You're not helping anybody practice communication because, again, if you don't read what they write, you're not going to help them. You're not helping them to discuss what's going on with the code. And in the end, you're also defeating empathy, because if you know nobody's going to be putting themselves in your shoes, then why should you care? So how do you actually help reviewers to prevent these mistakes from happening? First of all, a good way to help reviewers is to automate as much of the reviewing process as you can. So, for instance, you can have a linter to make sure that all your code being committed is automatically checked for style guides or for any other type of styling issues. Or you could have like a static analysis tool that makes sure that all your code conforms to a standard. Of course, you should be having automated tests to make sure that your code does what it's expected to do and it doesn't introduce any regressions. You may have a code coverage tool to make sure that the code being committed has the proper coverage. So any automation you can think about in your continuous integration process is basically going to help the reviewers by allowing them to abstract away from some checks. So all the checks that you can automate are going to be a relief for the reviewer because they don't have to do them. Another good way to help reviewers is to try and anticipate questions. So if it took you a while to figure out how to do something, verbalize your thought process, maybe in the pull request description, or maybe even in a code comment that explains how you got to a complex solution. So the idea is that you should try and reduce the back and forth between you and the reviewers, because your code should be easy to understand the first time they come across it. So, okay, you tried your best to help the reviewers, your code is ready, you wrote the best possible pull request description, and now you send away your pull request, and it's ready for review. So let's just flip hats for a moment and move to the other side. So we just got a pull request, and we have to review this. First of all, you open a pull request, and there is something wrong with the code you're reviewing. This is the best that can happen. I mean, of course, nobody likes to see something wrong with the code they're working on, but what happens when you spot something wrong in a pull request is that you're actually making the whole team a favor by preventing this wrong code, which may have a bug or may not be doing exactly what it should, before it goes to production. So fixing this is going to be way cheaper than fixing this once it has been released to production. So this is exactly the reason why we do code reviews, to spot something wrong before it goes to production. So meet this guy. He's called Venkat Subramaniam. He's a relatively famous speaker and writer. And I once have seen one of his talks, and he basically mentions what he calls tactical code reviewing. So basically what he does when he finds something wrong with a pull request he's reviewing is that he checks out the branch he's reviewing, he adds a unit test that fails because of the bug he spotted, and then pushes it back. So by doing so, the build will fail, and basically the bug he spotted will become evident. So it may look a bit like a passive-aggressive way to tell the rest of your team and the person whose code you're reviewing that there is a bug, but in the end, you get a couple of benefits. So by design, you improve your test coverage because you added a unit test. And there's not much room for discussion here. There's a very unquestionable reason to request changes because there's a bug and there's a test proving that it's there and the test is failing. So it needs to be passing before the builds can be purged. And it also gives you historical context, which is one of the benefits of having extensive test coverage, because you know that at some point this bug happened and it needed to be fixed. And like 6 months from now, when you're trying to figure out what this code does and why it does what it does, you'll have this test to provide you with historical context. So generally speaking, the approach I like to have when reviewing code written by somebody else is roughly the approach described by this book that I liked a lot. And it's basically summarized by the sentence, caring personally while challenging directly. So it means that you should be challenging the code, because in the end, you're going to be the one maintaining it. But you should also be aware that on the other side of the screen of your pull request, there's going to be a person. And you're going to be the one receiving the pull request anytime soon. So again, you should be challenging the code, but you should care for the person who wrote it. So this basically results in a set of do's and don'ts when reviewing a pull request. So first of all, in my opinion, you should be analyzing all the code for potential issues, which means that if a pull request is made up of 4 files and you found issues in the first 3, you may be thinking, okay, I just found issues in the first 3, I will skip the 4th, and then get back to it later when the issues in the first 3 files have been fixed. But this is going to be resulting in a back and forth and in the code being merged way later than it should be. So on every pass you do in reviewing the pull request, you should actually be analyzing all the code for issues, not just the first half. And this also means that you should be suggesting all possible improvements. So we just said that you should be caring for the person who wrote the code. And it may be tempting to say, okay, I just found out there are 3 issues in this pull request. I don't want to be too annoying, and I will skip the 4th for later, or maybe even skip over it and let it just pass. But in the end, what will happen is that if you do so, you'd be defeating the whole purpose of doing code reviews, because you will end up maintaining code that you would not have approved. Right? You're not helping the person who wrote this to improve their code. So they themselves may end up maintaining code that should have not been approved. So I get it that it may seem caring to pull any punches and to like not do all the suggestions that you may have, but in the end, you're helping the person who wrote the code better if you suggest all the possible improvements. And it also means that you should have high standards. So as we just said, you're going to end up maintaining this code. So it should be the best possible code that can be merged to your main branch. Because if it's not the best that it can be, somebody is going to have to fix this, and that somebody is likely going to be you. Of course, we said that code reviews are a great tool to have a precise discussion, which means that you should be focusing only on the code. Say, for instance, if the person whose code you're reviewing didn't bring any cake on their birthday, that's not really appropriate to mention that when reviewing their code. Or if they took your parking spot, or something like that. You should be focusing only on the code. And of course, you should be keeping the language or maybe even time zone barriers in mind. So this works especially when you're working on open source project. Say you may be working with people in a totally different part of the world, which may not be native speakers of the language they're writing in. So there may be some friction due to the language barriers, and maybe the tone is not going to sound as you would like, or something like that. So keep this in mind. You may not be communicating with a native speaker. So allow some extra room for this. And of course, you should allocate some time in your schedule for doing code reviews. Given what we just said, doing code reviews good takes time. And you should be setting apart some time to do so. I personally like to do code reviews right after lunch because I found out that they basically take a different type of attention and a different type of headspace, basically, than writing code. So it's a different mindset when I read code than when I write code. And my personal feeling is that I like to do this right after lunch. But of course, this depends on your choice. So there's a couple of things that you should not be doing when reviewing code. This should be implicit, but it's worth saying it out loud. So don't be a jerk. Basically, again, keep in mind that there's a person on the other side of the screen, and that person is going to be you when you send out your next pull request. So just try being kind. Don't talk about things that are not related to the code you're reviewing. So again, that birthday cake thing is not going to be involved in the discussion. Again, don't make this about the people rather than the code. I mean, the code you're reading has no feelings itself. The person who wrote it, they do, the code doesn't. So just stick to the code, basically. And it's really, there is no difference between code being written by a person or another. It's just about the code. And again, it's tempting to try and be kind or too kind by pulling some punches and saying, okay, this I just left you 6 comments and I don't want to be too harsh. Let's just leave the rest and let's merge it as it is because we just went back and forth 6 times and I feel like I'm being too harsh. If you stick to the code, there is no such thing as being too harsh. If you're just helping the rest of your team and the person you're reviewing, the person whose code you're reviewing, by having high standards and by not pulling any punches and making sure that the code they merge is the best it can be. And again, since doing code reviews takes time, just try not spending all your time doing code reviews. It's fun, I like it, it's helpful, it has a lot of benefits as we've just seen, but depending on your role in your team, I think doing this for 100% of your time is probably not the best thing. So let's flip hats again and say we sent out a pull request for review and we just got back a review and there's some comments in there, so it's not perfect as we thought, and there's, let's say, some room for improvement in there. So the first reaction you may have is this. So it happens to me as well. It happens to every software developer in the world, I think, that you basically identify yourself with the code you wrote because it's a manifestation of your thought, and then it's a manifestation of your identity, basically. It's who you are at some point. But there's some danger in there in that it's likely your code is not going to be perfect, and we want to make this evident by doing code reviews. And when this happens, it's not like you suck at your job. It's just that your code has some room for improvements. It's not you. It's just the code. You may be the best developer ever, and I've seen some of the best developer ever receiving comments on their pull request because they needed some improvements. It happens to everyone, and it doesn't mean they suck. Another possible reaction you may have is that the person who reviewed your code basically hates you, and they want to undermine you, they want to make you look bad. The thing is, if they've done the review the way they should, they don't. They just want to help you. They want your code and the team's code to be as good as it can be. And in the end, what they're trying to do is to help you learn how to make this better. They're not doing this themselves. They're helping you do this as a team. So are these two reactions helpful? Well, not really. So the approach I like to try and have, it's not always easy, but what I try to do when receiving a code review is to assume good intent. So this is basically the principle I try to go with whenever I receive a review or any type of feedback, actually, is to assume that the people or the person who sent you feedback or gave you feedback, they did so because they're trying to help you get better. They're trying to help the team get better. They're trying to help the code base get better. They don't hate you. They don't think you suck because you don't. They're just trying to help. So to summarize, I just want to close this with a quote from an author I like a lot. It's called Ryan Holiday. And he basically says that the difference between an amateur and a professional is that the amateur is defensive, while a professional likes being challenged. They like to be humbled because they see the path to improvement when they're allowed basically to learn something by being shown up. So yeah, if you have any questions or feedback, I will assume good intent.